Hello, welcome to another Maryland STEM Festival event. This event is the chemistry of cooking, and we have with us Lisa Bird from McCormick, a flavorist, flavor scientist, and she is going to be discussing some of the concept and some of the interactions and processes involved with chemistry and how it relates to creating flavors. So, Lisa, I am turning the program over to you, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm excited to be here today because what I have spent the last 20 years of my life doing is actually the chemistry of cooking. So we're going to go into a kind of a overview of pretty much the most major reaction in cooking, and we're going to talk about browning reactions. So a browning reaction is also known as a Maillard reaction, also known as non enzymatic browning. So you might ask, okay, well, what's enzymatic browning? Hey, have you ever eaten an apple or a pear and something happened and you put it down and then you came back and now your fruit has brown in it? That's enzymatic browning because that is because when you bite into it and you start to chew, you have released enzymes called phenolaces that actually work on that apple or pear and they'll create these brown colors. But I'm going to talk about a different kind of browning. This is a browning that you do when you're cooking. So all those wonderful aromas that you get when you bake or you're grilling or you're sauteing, all of that is coming from the Maillard reaction, also known as the browning reaction. And really what it is, it's interactions between the proteins and the sugars that are in your meat or your dough or whatever it is you are cooking. So let's do a little background on the Maillard reaction. Um, it's relatively new, I guess, as far as reactions. It was originally discovered by Louis Camille Maillard. And Dr. Maillard was a chemist in France. He was also a physician, and he was really interested in what was happening with proteins, particularly with urea. And he was trying to synthesize some proteins. And one of the things he found, he had some sugars there, and he was noticing this brown pigment that was forming as he worked with these things. And this was around 1912. And, I think he presented it and wrote it up in a paper, but really not a whole lot more happened with it. Then came another chemist, and his name was John Hodges. And John Hodges is actually really the person who took a deeper dive into the Maillard reaction. He was working for the USDA, he was an African American chemist, and he discovered the mechanism that all of this happens. So there's actually been talk in the scientific field about renaming the Maillard reaction as actually the Maillard Hodge reaction because really the understanding we have of it today is thanks to Dr. Hodges. And he was also working with the military because this is, it's 1953. We had just come off of World War II, and the Army was really interested about having delicious, nutritionally sound foods that tasted good for the troops. And cooking makes things taste better. So Dr. Hodges was doing a lot of work around that. Went back and revisited Dr. Maillard's work, and that's how come we have the understanding of the Maillard reaction today. But it's not done. There's still a lot of work doing on the Maillard reaction because it's not just one reaction. It's actually a cascade of reactions, but we'll get into that a little later on. So where do we see Maillard browning? Anytime you cook something. So when you cook something or you grill it or you sear it or you're barbecuing, you are making a Maillard reaction. We also see it when we bake things and in pastries or roasted vegetables, even in caramel. Because caramel, you're thinking, oh, wait a minute, that's a sauce or something, but it's still got protein in it from the milk, and it's got sugar and chocolate too. A lot of the flavor that we know about chocolate is because of that Maillard reaction. That's why a lot of chocolatiers are very careful about their processes because when they roast those cocoa beans, that's a Maillard reaction, and those conditions that they use are it's kind of like their signature chocolate. So let's talk a little bit about, well, what exactly is happening when I'm saying reactions between proteins and sugars? Well, you need two things, actually three, some water too, but it's mainly the protein half and the sugar half. But really in the protein, it's its building block, the amino acid, who is the rock star of this reaction. And amino acids are great because they have that amino group, it has a nitrogen in it. And the thing about nitrogen, it's really neat. If you look at its structure, it has what they call a lone pair of electrons, which makes that nitrogen in the center, it becomes very positively charged, and that makes it reactive. So it's positive, it's looking for electrons. So that makes it a really good half of a reaction to start. Now, amino acids, if you know from your biochemistry, we've got 21 essential amino acids. And amino acids are actually the driver of the flavor. So different amino acids are going to produce different aromas and flavors. For instance, if you want something meaty, you probably want to have some sulfur in there. So, maybe you're going to pick an amino acid like cysteine because it's got sulfur. Ever have that hard-boiled egg smell and that hydrogen sulfide? Well, that's because it's coming from cysteine. Now, by contrast, if you want something that's more baked bread, well, your amino acid that's important there is protein. So if you looked at the structure of wheat proteins, you're going to see a lot of protein in there. So you, as the flavor chemist, if you're designing these cooking reactions, it's really important to know what amino acid's going to go to what flavor profile. So you get to be creative in that. So let's talk about where we're getting the protein. Well, again, being a chemist is also kind of like your chemical chef with the Maillard reactions. So where can you get your proteins? Protein comes in a lot of different forms. So when we talked about amino acids and proteins, well, we can get them from the animal source. So if I am making, I'm grilling a steak, well, that muscle that makes up that steak is loaded with protein. And that, as that cooks and reacts with the sugars that are present in that steak, that's going to start making those classic meaty, beefy flavors. But it doesn't have to all come from an animal source. So for instance, yeast extracts, if you ever look on the back of a label and you'll see yeast extracts, or it's because they're loaded with protein. So yeasts, they're little cells that grow, but when you eat them, they're very savory. So I have a picture of Vegemite up there, and which is a popular spread, particularly in Europe and Australia, and they eat it because it's loaded with protein. Also, it can come from soy protein. You've probably seen, or wheat, or corn, or peat. All of these plant-based proteins are really nutritionally powerhouses, and they can be used in making a Maillard reaction. So for instance, if you plant-based proteins, very hot as far as the Impossible Burger uses it, Beyond Meat, all those different alternatives to meat are using these plant-based proteins. And again, they can be in the Maillard reaction too. Dairy proteins, you can't have a caramel flavor without dairy protein, but the whey, casein, these are proteins that are found naturally in milk, and they will participate in a Maillard reaction. So when you're making your creme brulee, the pudding that's in there, all those flavors that are generated from cooking with that's because of those dairy proteins. So let's talk about the other side of the Maillard reaction, the reducing sugar. Now, what do we mean about reducing sugars? Well, they're different than the table sugar that you would find, that you keep when you're baking your cookies. That table sugar is also known as sucrose, but it doesn't have a reducing sugar end. Remember, we were talking about the nitrogen and the amino acid and how that's positively charged? Well, the oxygen on that carbonyl that's on our reducing sugar, that's negatively charged. And we know opposites attract. So that nitrogen sees that positively charged oxygen and it wants to combine with that sugar. So that's why the reducing sugar is important. In sucrose, it doesn't have that carbonyl end because that's where, so sucrose is made up of a molecule of glucose and a molecule of fructose, and they're hooked together so that it doesn't have that active carbonyl. So that's why, it's not considered a reducing sugar, but there are a lot of reducing sugars that you have heard of. So for instance, glucose, fructose, xylose. Now glucose and fructose, they're both both 6-carbon sugars, but xylose is a 5-carbon sugar. And we found that he's the most reactive out of all those reducing sugars. And it kind of makes sense. It's smaller, it's more agile, it can get in and react with that nitrogen faster because it's not quite as bulky. Now, where can you get these reducing sugars? Well, you can use the powders, but you can also use syrup. So, for instance, if you had like maple syrup, that's got glucose and fructose in it, and that would participate in a Maillard reaction. So let's take a look at all the crazy things going on in a Maillard reaction. And this is kind of where Dr. Hodges' work came in. So he was the one who mapped this whole thing out here. And the Maillard reaction, so when we were talking about that carbonyl and that amino acid hooking up, they come together and they form something called a Schiff's base. And that forms a molecule called a glycosylamine. Well, this molecule is not very stable. So as soon as it forms, it doesn't really hang around. It starts rearranging itself because, the electrons are jumping around to try and get in a more comfortable position in that molecule. And it can go in all different pathways. So remember I was saying that Maillard reaction is not just one reaction. It's a whole bunch of stuff. So it forms Amadori compounds. Now, if we started with fructose, that's a keto sugar. So that would go into the Haynes compounds. So there's all kinds of crazy reactions going on. And then they go on to form other things. And then once those reactants are there, they start reacting with themselves and they'll cyclize and they'll make bigger molecules, or they'll react again with the amino acids and make the Strecker aldehydes. There's all kinds of chemistry going on. So it's really hard to make one definite, you don't make just one compound with a Maillard reaction. Matter of fact, if you made one of these reactions and you made an extract and you put it in your gas chromatograph, you would probably have 1,000 peaks on there. But that's why it tastes good. Our tongues love complexity. So when we eat something, we want a lot going on in our mouth. And that's why the Maillard reaction is so delicious. So we talked about the reaction, right? We need the protein, we need the sugar, but the third thing that's really critical is the heat. Not that a Maillard reaction can't happen without heat, but it's very, very slow. So for instance, when you get like age spots on your hands and things like that, really you're seeing Maillard chemistry at work, but it takes a long time for that to happen. Sometimes there is a certain type of cataract that will happen in your eyes because in your eyes you have proteins and you have your sugar and you have sunlight, all those things putting the energy in to make it, but it takes years and years and years. That's why heat's really important, because heat is what speeds the whole thing up. And you need to be probably at least 150 degrees Fahrenheit really to start getting some appreciable reaction. So also, time and temperature really affects the type of products you're going to form. So think about low and slow when you cook something versus searing something. Again, different chemistry happens because of the amount of heat and the time it's exposed. So, with barbecue, that meat is tenderizing. You're cooking something on a lower heat, but maybe for 10 hours. But all of that chemistry is going on there in a slow process versus you've got a great steak and you sear the outside. You can also see the effects of time and temperature when, say, you're baking cookies. Think about if, you put your cookies in and you go and you check them after 9 minutes and maybe they're not brown enough. Well, then you have to put it back in because you're putting more energy into that system and getting all those compounds to form. So heat, very important. Other factors that can help the Maillard reaction. Well, there's a lot of things. For instance, how much water you have in the system definitely affects it. Matter of fact, one of the terms we use in food science is something called water activity. And that means the available water that's in a food system. So the lower your water activity goes, it means that there's less and less water. It actually speeds up the Maillard reaction. Also pressure. I mean, if you think about it, the higher the pressure, the more browning you're getting. Suppose you're cooking in a pressure cooker. So that's going to speed up the reaction because, it's a sealed system and there's energy going in, and it heats it up. So all these reactions are happening faster. And pH, very important. And again, it gets back to our friend nitrogen because it's all about the electrons around that. And if you think about it, the higher the pH, the faster that Maillard reaction goes. Well, who cares? What does that mean to me? It means a lot to you if you're making some pretzels, because when you make pretzels, think about it. First thing you do, you make your dough. And what's in that dough? That dough has flour, which has protein. It's also got sugars present. So, hey, we've got our two reactants for the Maillard reaction. We've also got yeast in there too. That's going to contribute some protein, but it's also causing your dough to rise. So you roll it out and you make your pretzel. But before you bake it and add your heat, what do? You usually dip it in a solution of baking soda. Well, what's baking soda? Baking soda is a base. So it's going to up our pH on the surface of that pretzel. So now we have awesome conditions for a Maillard reaction. We bake our pretzel, and that characteristic brown coating on a pretzel that we associate with a pretzel taste is because of that higher pH. So again, you have to think about all these factors when you're creating a flavor, especially a Maillard flavor. One of the things too about Maillard reactions, overall, they're mostly good because they create all those delicious foods. And cooking your food is a good thing because, heat is one of the best ways to kill bacteria. You wouldn't eat raw chicken. It would make you really sick. You have to cook it. And it makes it taste better. But you've probably heard in the news about acrylamide, particularly in fried foods. And it actually happened on a study. They were looking at processed foods, and they found actually it was around pet foods. And pet foods see a lot of heat. They have proteins and sugars. They're made through extruders. And they were finding that this acrylamide was forming. And acrylamide has been linked with cancer. So it's not a great thing. But they found that animals, like domestic pets, had higher acrylamide than wild animals, and it's because they were eating the processed food. Now, in low dosages, it's not going to hurt you. I mean, unless you are pounding French fries every day and eating everything fried, you're probably not in trouble. Basically, acrylamide's formed when, again, a specific amino acid, asparagine, reacts with sugar and it forms this. But overall, if you're eating everything in moderation, this is probably not going to be an issue for you. Well, what about fats? So we talked about Maillard reaction being proteins and sugars, but fats are really important to the flavor of our foods too. I mean, think about when you saute something. Most chefs will finish something with butter because that fat's going to enhance the overall flavor. Think about marbling in meats. Take Wagyu beef. If you look at that beef cut in the raw form, it has all kinds of little white fat lines through it. But when you cook, you've got this Maillard reaction going on, but that fat is melting through it, and those fat products will react with all the really nice Maillard products too. And so that's why it's kind of like layering in that flavor. Stir frying, sauteing, deep frying, all of those things are different ways to create flavor. The other really cool thing about fat is it keeps flavor on your tongue longer. So, it's kind of coating the tongue. The flavor molecules get a chance to sit there and interact with your taste receptors. And, it'll go up, it'll stay in your mouth, and your olfactory senses go up into your nose, so you get that full flavor experience. Now, another part I wanted to talk about, which is not a Maillard reaction, but I wanted to mention it because, again, this is probably chemistry you've done at home too, and that's caramelization, which is also known as the browning of sugar. Now, the reason it's different than a Maillard reaction is because there are no amino acids involved. It's actually sugar itself decomposing, and it forms all those brown compounds as well. So, for instance, I have a picture of toasting marshmallows. Again, that sugar in the marshmallow and the high heat from the flame is pyrolyzing those sugars and giving you those brown toasty compounds. Same thing when they have the blowtorch and you're making creme brulee, and you have your custard and then you sprinkle the sugar on the top of the custard, and then that torch actually is causing that pyrolysis, and that gives that crusty, delicious coating that is on the surface of it. So that is my whole presentation, but I have time to take questions if anybody is interested.
Well, Lisa, we don't have any questions, but that was an excellent presentation, and we very much appreciate you presenting. Let me double check. Oh, wait, actually, are there any side products to the Maillard reaction?
You mean, well, all of there's many different change for it, but there'll be intermediates that come through, and then they go on. A lot of these things aren't stable in the middle of the reaction, so they'll go on and they'll form other things. So they can form actually several different things. One of the things is they'll cyclize and they'll form pyrazines. So pyrazines are those compounds like nutty or roasted. If you're tasting nutty or roasted, you're probably getting a pyrazine.
Okay.
So yeah.
All right. So that was the only question. It was an excellent presentation, very informative, and I've learned a lot. And we thank you very much for doing it for us.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me.
All right. Let me